The air in Thompson's John Deere dealership hung thick and sterile, a world away from the honest smell of turned earth and diesel exhaust. It smelled of new rubber, fresh paint, and something else, the cloying scent of easy credit. Earl Miller stood at the parts counter, his knuckles stained with grease that soap and a stiff brush couldn't conquer, a small, sheared-off bolt held carefully in his calloused palm. He was 62 years old in the spring of 1973, and his face was a road map of every drought, flood, and bumper crop he'd ever lived through. Across the counter, Chet Thompson leaned back in his squeaking vinyl chair, a smirk playing on his lips. Chet was half Earl's age, with soft hands and a haircut that cost more than Earl's work boots. He'd inherited the dealership from his father, a man Earl had respected, but Chet had transformed it. The old wooden bins of loose bolts and gaskets were gone, replaced by shrink-wrapped parts on chrome racks. The pot-bellied stove where farmers used to gather was replaced by a coffee machine that dispensed a watery, bitter brew. A governor linkage bolt for a 54 Model 60? Chet chuckled, not even bothering to look at the part. Earl, we haven't stocked parts for those old two-poppers in a decade. It's all computerized inventory now. If it ain't in the system, it doesn't exist. He gestured vaguely toward the gleaming behemoth that dominated the showroom floor. Now that 4430 over there, that's a real tractor. Sound guard body, air conditioning, 8-track player, 125 horsepower at the PTO. You could plow your whole quarter section before lunch and not even break a sweat. Earl ignored the sales pitch. He'd been hearing it for years. The part number is B273R, he said, his voice a low rumble. Your father used to keep a box of them in the back, on the second shelf from the bottom, right behind the fan belts for the old letter series Farmals. Chet sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. My father also used a hand crank adding machine. Times change, Earl. You can't run a modern farm with museum pieces. Rick Peterson was just in here yesterday. Traded in his 4020, didn't even have 5,000 hours on it. Drove out with a new 4630. Said he's buying the old Henderson place. That's another 300 acres. You can't cover ground like that with a tractor that tops out at 6 miles an hour. Rick Peterson also has a note at the bank so long, it'd take a week to read it, Earl said flatly. I own my land, I own my machines, I sleep at night. This was the core of it, the fundamental chasm between their two worlds. For Chet, the dealership wasn't just about selling tractors, it was about selling a vision of the future. A future built on leverage, expansion, and ever-increasing debt. For Earl, farming was about stewardship, about self-reliance, about ending each year with more in his pocket than he started with, no matter how humble the amount. Chet laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed in the big metal building. You sleep at night on 160 acres of dirt that's barely making you a living. Rick's going to be farming nearly 1,000 acres. He's building an empire. You're polishing brass on a sinking ship, Earl. A slow anger, cold and hard as forged steel, began to build in Earl's chest. He'd heard the whispers at the co-op, seen the pitying looks from younger farmers. They called his place the Miller Museum. They saw his debt-free status not as a virtue, but as a sign of his failure to be ambitious. That sinking ship, as you call it, Earl said, his voice dangerously quiet, is worth more than this whole shiny showroom and every tractor in it. My father homesteaded that land. We paid it off during the Depression, when men like your grandfather were losing everything. There isn't a banker in 3 counties holds a single sheet of paper on my operation. Every building, every machine, every acre is mine. free and clear. Chet propped his feet up on the counter, crossing his polished loafers. The arrogance was suffocating. Free and clear don't mean much when you're not growing, Earl. What's 160 acres worth? 200,000? Maybe 250 on a good day? Rick's new tractor cost a tenth of that. Earl looked Chet square in the eye. He hadn't intended to say it, but the younger man's condescension had pushed a button that had been dormant for years. Let me tell you something, son. That land, those old machines you laugh at, my whole operation, the way I've built it, the way my father taught me, if I had to put a price on it today, the whole thing's worth $5 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of the fluorescent lights. Then, Chet Thompson threw his head back and roared with laughter. It wasn't a chuckle, it was a deep, belly-shaking guffaw of pure disbelief. He slapped the counter, his face turning red. $5 million, he wheezed, wiping a tear from his eye. Earl, you've been out in the sun too long. $5 million for a patch of dirt and a collection of junk? You couldn't get $5 million if you found oil bubbling up in your cornfield. Earl didn't flinch. He let the younger man have his laugh. He simply curled his fingers around the sheared bolt in his palm, the sharp edges digging into his skin. You think in terms of loans and payments? He said calmly. You see a tractor, and you see a price tag and a financing plan. I see a tool I own, a tool that will still be running 20 years from now because I know how to fix it. You see land as collateral. I see it as a legacy. You wouldn't understand the difference. He turned and walked toward the door, his work boots making solid, deliberate sounds on the polished concrete floor. The laughter died down behind him, replaced by a dismissive snort. As Earl pushed the glass door open, the clean, artificial air of the dealership was replaced by the familiar spring breeze, rich with the smell of damp earth and distant manure. It was the smell of his world, a world Chet Thompson couldn't possibly comprehend. He knew the dealer, and the rest of them thought he was a fool, an old man clinging to the past. But Earl knew something they didn't. He knew the difference between value and price, and he knew a storm was coming, one that all the new paint and easy credit in the world couldn't protect them from. Now, before we go any further, I want to ask you folks listening, who do you think had it right back there in '73? Was it Earl, with his old iron and his fierce independence, owning everything outright? Or was it the new way of thinking, like Rick and the dealer Chet, using the bank's money to get bigger, faster, and chase the dream of a farming empire? Let me know down in the comments what you would have done. I'd be mighty interested to hear your thoughts. Earl drove his 10-year-old Ford F-100 down the gravel road, the sheared linkage bolt rolling on the dashboard with every bump. The laughter from the dealership still echoed in his ears, a bitter reminder of how out of step he was. He wasn't angry anymore, just a low, simmering resolve settling in his gut. He turned into his own lane, a lane flanked by 100-year-old oak trees his grandfather had planted. The house, a simple white clapboard structure, was solid and well kept. The barns, painted a deep, traditional red, showed their age but stood straight and true. There was no rust on the metal roofs, no sagging doors. Everything was in its place. His workshop was his sanctuary. It was the heart of the farm, more so than the house or even the fields. It was a long, low building he'd built himself with timber from his own woodlot. Inside, it smelled of history, a potent cocktail of cold steel, cutting oil, stale coffee, and sweat. Along one wall stood a massive metal lathe he'd bought at an auction when the old Studebaker plant closed down. Next to it was a drill press that looked like it belonged in a battleship's engine room, and a forge with a hand-cranked blower his father had used. Tools hung in orderly ranks on the walls, wrenches, sockets, and calipers of every conceivable size, each one clean and wiped with an oily rag after use, each one in its designated spot. This was where Earl Miller waged his war against obsolescence. He clamped the broken half of the bolt into a vise, studying the sheared surface under the bright light of a bare bulb. A clean break. Metal fatigue, most likely. 40,000 hours of vibration and heat had finally taken their toll. A new one would have cost less than $1 if Chet had bothered to stock it. Now, Earl would have to make one. It would take him 3 hours. 3 hours he should have been spending in the field getting his corn planter ready. He selected a piece of grade 8 steel rod from a rack, its diameter just a fraction larger than the original bolt. He measured it with a pair of worn but precise Mitutoyo calipers, double-checking his numbers on a greasy notepad. He fired up the lathe, the big electric motor humming to life with a familiar thrum. The sharp, metallic scent of hot steel filled the air as the carbide cutter bit into the spinning rod, peeling away a perfect, shimmering curl of metal. He worked with a surgeon's focus, his hand steady, his movements economical. He cut the threads with a die, his touch so practiced he could feel the slightest imperfection in the metal through the handle. He drilled the tiny hole for the cotter pin on the drill press, his eye lining it up perfectly, without a single measurement. Finally, he took the newly formed bolt to the forge. He worked the bellows, and the coal bed began to glow. First a dull red, then a cherry, then a bright, almost white-hot orange. He heated the bolt head, then quenched it in a bucket of used motor oil. The hiss and plume of acrid smoke was a ritual as old as blacksmithing itself, case hardening. It would make the bolt strong, stronger than the original. As he worked, his mind drifted. He thought of his father, a man who could fix a broken axle with nothing but a forge and a hammer. His father had despised debt. "A banker's pen," he used to say, "has broken more farmers than a decade of drought." That lesson was seared into Earl's soul. He'd watched neighbors in the 50s get talked into buying new equipment they didn't need, only to lose their farms when the prices fell. He'd seen the cycle repeat itself, over and over. A few good years, a rush of optimism, a flood of easy credit, and then the inevitable bust. The scorn from the community was getting worse. At the grain elevator, the talk was all about the new pivot irrigators, 6-figure combines, and the price of land, which was climbing by the day. When Earl walked in, the conversations would sometimes fall quiet. They saw him as a ghost from a past they were trying to outrun. Last week, at the Sunday potluck after church, Rick Peterson had cornered him by the dessert table. "Earl," Rick had said, his voice full of false concern, "I heard you were trying to find a part for that old 60. You know, I'd be happy to come over with my 40-20 and get your planting done for you. Probably knock it out in a single afternoon." The offer was couched in neighborly kindness, but the insult was clear. Rick was offering charity, positioning himself as the successful, modern farmer helping the poor old relic. "I appreciate the offer, Rick," Earl had replied, keeping his voice even. "But I'll manage. My ground's not going anywhere." "It's just... people are talking," Rick had pressed on. "They see you out there, on that old junk, working yourself to the bone. It's a new age, Earl. You gotta leverage your assets. The bank is practically giving money away. You could double your acreage, triple your income, and quadruple my debt," Earl had finished for him. "No thank you. I'm not interested in farming for the bank." Rick had just shaken his head and walked away, a look of pity on his face. That look stung worse than Chet Thompson's laughter. It was the look of a man who was absolutely certain he was right, and that Earl was a fool destined for failure. The work was undeniably harder. When Rick Peterson was disking a field, he was in an enclosed cab, listening to the radio, the air conditioner humming. When Earl was on his John Deere 720 diesel, he was sitting out in the open. The percussive pop, 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 pop of the big two-cylinder engine was a constant, deafening companion. The dust coated his skin, filled his lungs, and gritted in his teeth. At the end of a 14-hour day, his ears would ring for hours, and every bone in his body would ache from the vibration and the jolting of the steel seat. At night, while Rick was at home with his family, Earl was often back in the shop, under the glare of a single bulb, replacing a worn bearing or welding a cracked bracket, his dinner growing cold on the kitchen table. His wife, Martha, never complained, but he saw the worry in her eyes. He was fighting a one-man war against time, rust, and the relentless march of progress, and it was taking its toll. He finished the new bolt and threaded it into the governor linkage on the Model 60's engine block. It fit perfectly. He tightened it down, inserted a new cotter pin, and stood back, wiping his hands on an already black rag. It was a small victory, but it was his. He hadn't paid Chet Thompson a dime. He hadn't signed a single loan document. He had solved his own problem with his own two hands. He fired up the tractor, and the old two-cylinder engine barked to life, settling into its familiar, rhythmic cadence. It was the sound of independence. It was the sound of survival. The next few years were a blur of golden harvests and soaring prices. The mid-70s were the boom years, the likes of which no one had ever seen. Russian grain deals, global food shortages, and rampant inflation sent corn and soybean prices into the stratosphere. The mantra echoing from the USDA, the banks, and the equipment dealerships was "get big or get out." Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly taking out massive loans, betting the family farm on the belief that the good times would never end. Rick Peterson was the poster child for the new prosperity. He bought the Henderson place, then the old Schmidt farm when Gus Schmidt retired. He was farming over 1,200 acres now. His farmstead looked like a dealership lot. 2 brand-new John Deere 4840s sat next to a massive 7700 turbo combine with an 8-row corn head. He put up 4 new grain bins, gleaming silver silos that towered over the countryside. He tore down his old farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style home with a 2-car garage and a swimming pool in the back. He drove a new Cadillac, and his wife wore diamond rings. To everyone in the county, Rick Peterson was a visionary, a man who had seized the moment and become a king. Chet Thompson's dealership expanded too. He added 2 new service bays and hired 3 more mechanics. He held a massive customer appreciation barbecue every summer with a whole roasted hog and a country band. Earl was never invited. He'd walk into the dealership for hydraulic fluid or a filter, and the place would be buzzing with farmers talking about land auctions and the price of anhydrous ammonia. They'd nod curtly at Earl, their eyes sweeping over his faded overalls and worn-out boots before turning back to their conversations about $500,000 loans. He was an anachronism, a living fossil they tolerated, but didn't understand. Earl was making good money, too. The best money of his life. A bushel of corn was fetching prices his father wouldn't have believed possible. But his life didn't change. He sold his grain, paid his taxes, and put the profits into certificates of deposit at the local bank. He didn't buy more land, even when the widow across the road offered him her 80 acres for a price that seemed like a bargain. He knew it wasn't a bargain if it meant taking on a mortgage. He kept his old machines running. He gave the Farm All M a complete engine overhaul one winter, grinding the valves, putting in new sleeves and pistons, and painting it a perfect gleaming red. He found a used John Deere 45 combine, a small 2-row machine, at an auction for next to nothing, and rebuilt it from the ground up. To his neighbors, it was insanity. He was a millionaire on paper, sitting on land that was appreciating by 20% a year. Yet he was acting like it was still 1934. His son, David, home from college for the summer, couldn't understand it. "Dad, Rick Peterson just bought a brand new ski boat. His kids are going to the lake every weekend. We're making more money than we ever have, and you're out in the shop patching a tire on a 30-year-old hay wagon. Why?" Earl looked up from the tire, his hands covered in black rubber dust. "Because that boat is owned by the bank. The new tractors are owned by the bank. Most of that land is owned by the bank. Rick Peterson is just the hired man on his own farm, and he doesn't even know it. We own this wagon. We own that tractor. We own that land. There's a difference, son. A big one." But David just shook his head, the logic of his father's world completely alien to him. The pressure was immense. Earl felt it from his son, from the community, even sometimes from the quiet, worried glances from Martha. He was seen as a failure, a man paralyzed by fear, squandering the greatest opportunity in the history of American agriculture. One hot evening in the late summer of 1979, Earl sat on his porch swing, listening to the crickets and the far-off rumble of a tractor. It was nearly 10 o'clock at night, but Rick Peterson was still out there, his headlights cutting swaths through the darkness. The sound of his new 4840 was different from Earl's old 2-cylinders. It was a high-pitched, screaming whine from the turbocharger, a sound of immense power, but also of constant, unrelenting stress. It sounded hungry. Martha came out and sat beside him, handing him a glass of iced tea. "He's going to work himself into an early grave," she said quietly, nodding toward the distant lights. "It's not the work that'll get him," Earl said, taking a slow sip. "It's the interest." On the small radio sitting on the porch railing, a news announcer's voice cut through the static. He was talking about something happening in Washington. A man named Paul Volcker, the new chairman of the Federal Reserve, was making speeches about a war on inflation. He was talking about tightening the money supply, about raising interest rates to unprecedented levels. The announcer treated it as a dry piece of financial news, a distant problem for bankers and Wall Street brokers. But Earl Miller heard it for what it was. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. It wasn't the sound of distant thunder. It was the sound of the first drop of rain in a hurricane. He looked out across his fields, dark and silent under the moon, every square inch of them his. Then he looked over at the frantic, screaming lights of Rick Peterson's new world, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that a great reckoning was coming. The first sign of trouble arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a whisper on the radio in January of 1980, an embargo on grain sales to the Soviet Union. To the men in Washington, it was a geopolitical chess move. To the farmers in the heartland, it was a kick in the teeth. The bottom fell out of the market overnight. Corn that had been selling for over $3 a bushel was suddenly struggling to fetch $2. At the grain elevator, the confident swagger of the boom years evaporated, replaced by tight-lipped worry. The talk was no longer of buying more land, but of how to cover the fuel bills for spring planting. For Earl, it meant a smaller check from the co-op. It was a disappointment, but not a disaster. His costs were fixed and low. For Rick Peterson, it was the first tremor in the foundation of his empire. His operating loan for the coming year was based on $3 corn. Now, his projected income was slashed by a third before he'd even put a seed in the ground. The high-pitched scream of his 4840s could be heard later into the night, as if He could outwork the collapsing market. Then the sky turned against them. The spring was dry. The rains of April and May never came. June arrived, hot and merciless. The young corn, which should have been knee-high and a deep, waxy green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the day to conserve what little moisture the soil held. Earl watched his fields with a familiar ache. He'd seen droughts before. He cultivated his rows shallow and often with his old Farmall M, trying to create a dust mulch to stop the evaporation, a technique his father had taught him. It was slow, tedious work. But it helped. Rick's fields, stretching over vast open plains, baked under the sun. His new minimum tillage methods, designed for speed and efficiency in good years, left the soil exposed. The wind began to peel the topsoil away in fine brown clouds that hazed the horizon. One afternoon, Earl was in his shop when he saw Rick's service truck race down the road, followed by the big white van from Thompson's dealership. He watched through his binoculars as the mechanic worked on one of the giant 4840s, parked idle in the middle of a half-planted field. The next day, Earl saw Rick at the gas station. His face was gaunt, his eyes rimmed with red from lack of sleep. "Hydraulic pump went out," Rick said, his voice flat and weary. "Took the guy 6 hours to diagnose it. Said the main control valve assembly is shot. Part has to be flown in from Moline. Be 3 days, maybe 4. And the bill? Chet wants $4,000. $4,000 and the tractor is just sitting there." Earl nodded slowly. "That's tough, Rick. A pump on my 720. I can rebuild it on my bench in an afternoon. Parts cost me maybe $50. Rick just stared at him, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Not pity this time, but a sliver of desperate envy. "Yeah, well," he mumbled, turning away. "You can't plant 1,000 acres with a 720. He left without another word. The drought broke in July with a terrifying violence. A line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised, greenish black. The wind came first, a physical wall that flattened Earl's prize stand of sweet corn and tore a sheet of metal roofing from the old hog barn. Then came the hail. It wasn't the pea-sized stuff. It was golf balls, then baseballs, that hammered the earth with a deafening roar. Earl and Martha huddled in their cellar, listening to the storm trying to tear their world apart. When it was over, the ground was white. The fields were a ruin. What the drought hadn't killed, the hail had shredded. The corn was stripped to bare stalks, the soybeans pounded into the mud. Earl walked his fields, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the mangled leaves. A year's work, destroyed in 15 minutes. He felt the familiar, bitter sting of loss. But beneath it, a solid bedrock of resolve. It was a bad year. There had been bad years before. They would tighten their belts. They would survive. He looked across the road at Rick's farm. The massive grain bins, his symbols of prosperity, were dented and pockmarked, as if they'd been strafed with machine gun fire. The brick ranch house had broken windows, and the Cadillac in the driveway had its windshield smashed out. The devastation was absolute. Rick had borrowed against those bins. He had borrowed against the harvest that now lay in tatters on the ground. He had no reserves. He had no bedrock. The cracks in Chet Thompson's world began to show too. The flow of farmers eager to trade in perfectly good equipment for the latest model had slowed to a trickle. His service bays were full, but many of the repair bills were going unpaid. He had a massive inventory of new tractors and combines sitting on his lot, financed by the John Deere Corporation at an interest rate that was climbing every month. The gleaming showroom, once a symbol of boundless optimism, now felt like a mausoleum. The coffee from the machine tasted more bitter than ever. The final blow came from the same place the trouble began. Washington. To fight the inflation caused by the oil crisis, the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker jacked up the prime interest rate. It rose to 15%, then 18%. By the end of the year, it peaked at a staggering 21.5%. For farmers like Rick Peterson, who held variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. A loan that was manageable at 8% became an inescapable monster at 20%. The numbers no longer made sense. You couldn't grow a crop that would pay back that kind of interest, even in a perfect year. And this year was a catastrophe. The winter of 1981 was the quietest Earl could remember. The usual optimism of planning for the next season was gone, replaced by a pervasive, chilling fear. The bank, once so eager to lend, was now a predator. Loan officers who had taken farmers out for steak dinners were now cold-eyed strangers who spoke only of liquidation and foreclosure. The notices started appearing in the county paper, tacked to the bulletin board at the courthouse. Farm auctions. So many farm auctions. They weren't the festive retirement auctions of the past, with neighbors laughing and bidding on old tools. These were funerals. Families stood silently, their faces ashen, as the auctioneer's rhythmic chant disassembled their lives, piece by piece. Tractors, plows, tools, livestock. Then the auctioneer would move to the front porch of the house and sell the family home and the land itself. Earl watched as farms that had been in the same family for 100 years were sold for a fraction of what they had been valued at just 2 years prior. The buyers were often faceless corporations or insurance companies from out of state, vultures picking the bones clean. Rick Peterson's auction was scheduled for a cold, bleak day in March. Earl went, not to bid, but to bear witness. The sight was heartbreaking. The two massive 4840s, symbols of Rick's ambition, looked pathetic and oversized sitting in the muddy yard. The 7700 combine, with its dented grain tank, sold for less than what Rick still owed on it. His tools, his pickup, everything went under the hammer. Earl saw Chet Thompson there, his face pale, trying to get a decent price for the equipment he was repossessing. But the market was flooded. There were no buyers with cash, and no banks willing to lend. The final item was the farm itself. 1,200 acres, the new brick house, the dented bins. The auctioneer started the bidding. There was a long, terrible silence. No one moved. The local farmers who had survived had no money and no stomach for profiting from their neighbors' misery. Finally, a man in a suit representing a Chicago investment firm made the opening bid. It was insultingly low. With no other bidders, the gavel fell. The sound echoed across the silent crowd like a gunshot. Rick Peterson's empire was gone. Earl watched as Rick and his family got into their old station wagon, the last vehicle they owned, and drove away down the lane they would never call theirs again. He didn't see a fool who had overreached. He saw a good man who had believed a lie sold to him by men in suits. That spring, Earl's farm was an island of activity in a sea of paralysis. Many of his neighbors' fields lay fallow, their owners tangled in bankruptcy proceedings. Earl hooked his old John Deere 60 to his 4-row planter and went to work. The familiar pop, pop, pop of the 2-cylinder engine was a comforting, defiant rhythm in the quiet countryside. One afternoon, the engine sputtered and died with a sickening clatter of metal. Earl climbed down and pulled the inspection plate. A connecting rod had snapped. It was a catastrophic failure. In the boom years, it would have been an excuse to buy a new tractor. Now, it was just a problem to be solved. He spent the next day pulling the engine apart with a chain hoist hung from a beam in his shop. He found the broken parts, loaded them in his pickup, and drove an hour to a salvage yard, a sprawling graveyard of rusting farm machinery. He spent half the day digging through the remains of other dead tractors until he found what he needed, a matching rod and piston from a scrapped Model 60. It cost him $40. Back in his shop, he spent the next 3 days meticulously rebuilding the engine. He honed the cylinder, measured the clearances with his calipers, torqued the bolts to spec. It was greasy, painstaking work. While he worked, he thought of Rick Peterson and his $4,000 hydraulic pump. Earl's total cost for this repair would be less than $50 and his own time. When he was done, he bolted the engine back into the frame, filled it with oil and hit the starter. The old tractor coughed once, twice, and then barked back to life, settling into its steady, rhythmic pulse. The sound of self-reliance, the sound of true wealth. The crisis hollowed out the community. The population of the county dropped for the first time since the Great Depression. The school consolidated with the one in the next town over. Main Street was a ghost town of shuttered storefronts. The hardest hit was Thompson's John Deere. The showroom floor was empty except for a few dusty lawn mowers. The service bays were quiet. Chet had laid off all his mechanics except for one old-timer. He'd lost the dealership franchise. The sign out front just read, Thompson's Repair. One morning in the spring of 1985, Earl was in his shop grinding a set of plowshares when a car he didn't recognize pulled into his lane. It was a dusty, 10-year-old Chevy sedan with a muffler that was about to go. Chet Thompson got out. He looked 10 years older than he had during the boom. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by the deep-etched lines of worry. His expensive suit was gone too, replaced by simple work pants and a faded polo shirt. He walked toward the workshop with the hesitant steps of a man who knows he is about to have to eat a large helping of crow. "Earl," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't offer to shake hands. "Chet," Earl replied, shutting off the grinder. He wiped his hands on a rag and waited. Chet looked around the workshop, his eyes taking in the lathe, the forge, the orderly rows of tools. It was the first time he'd ever set foot in here. He saw not a museum of junk, but a temple of survival. "The bank is calling my note," Chet said, his gaze fixed on a crack in the concrete floor. "On the building. I'm 3 months behind. They're going to foreclose next month. I'll lose everything. My father's. Everything." Earl didn't say anything. He just listened. "I'm trying to sell what's left of my parts inventory," Chet continued, his voice cracking slightly. "Mostly for the older stuff now. That's all anyone is running. Found a whole crate of old 2-cylinder parts in the attic. Gaskets, bearings, even found a box of those governor linkage bolts you were looking for that day." He managed a weak, humorless smile. "You were right about where they were." He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Earl's. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a raw, desperate humility. "I came to ask, I know it's a long shot, if you'd be interested in buying my tool inventory. The big hydraulic press, the valve grinder. I'd sell it cheap. I just need to raise some cash. Anything." Earl thought back to that day in the showroom, the laughter, the condescending lecture about sinking ships and polishing brass. He felt a brief, hot flash of satisfaction, the part of him that wanted to say, "I told you so." But it passed as quickly as it came. He saw before him not an enemy, but just another casualty of the storm. "I don't need your tools, Chet," Earl said, his voice even. "I have everything I need right here." Chet's shoulders slumped. "Yeah, I figured. Sorry to have bothered you." He turned to leave. "But I might be interested in the building," Earl said. Chet stopped, turning back slowly, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "The building?" "Earl, it's a 50,000 square foot steel building. The bank wants $75,000 to clear the note. Where would you get that kind of money? Earl walked over to his workbench and unlocked a heavy metal file cabinet. He pulled out a stack of certificates of deposit, held together with a thick rubber band. He'd been cashing them in as they matured, sensing that opportunities might arise. "I don't deal with banks," Earl said simply, handing the stack to Chet. "I'll give you $80,000 for the building. That's $75,000 for the bank, and $5,000 for you to get back on your feet. It's a cash offer. We can have the papers drawn up by the end of the week." Chet stared at the CDs, then at Earl, his mouth hanging open. He seemed to be struggling to process what was happening. But why? What would you do with a building that big? "I'm going to lease it back to you," Earl said. "For $500 a month. You can run your repair shop. Focus on keeping this old iron running for the folks around here who are still trying to farm. You're a good mechanic, Chet. You were just a terrible banker. Your father was a good man. He wouldn't want to see his name scraped off that building." Chet looked down at the ground, and for a long moment Earl thought he might refuse. Then he saw Chet's shoulders begin to shake. The younger man covered his face with his hands, and a dry, racking sob escaped him, the sound of a man's pride finally breaking. After a few moments, he composed himself, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked at Earl, his expression stripped bare of all pretense. "That day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That day in the showroom, you said your farm was worth $5 million. I laughed at you. I called you a fool." "I remember," Earl said. "I get it now," Chet said, his voice barely a whisper. "It was never about the price of the land, was it? It was about this. The freedom to do this. The power to survive, to help a neighbor, to sleep at night. That's the $5 million. "That's it," Earl said with a nod. "That's it exactly." Word of what Earl had done spread through the county. The perspective began to shift. He was no longer the old relic. He was the man who had seen the storm coming when no one else had. Farmers started stopping by his workshop, not for charity, but for advice. A young farmer trying to keep his grandfather's Farmel H running, a neighbor needing help setting the timing on an old Alice Chalmers. Earl's workshop became the new heart of the community, a place where knowledge was shared freely and the coffee was brewed strong on an old hot plate. One day, a dusty pickup pulled in. It was Rick Peterson. He'd been working as a hired hand on a big corporate farm 2 counties over. He looked weathered, but healthier than he had in years. He'd come to ask if Earl needed any help during harvest. Earl hired him on the spot. They worked side by side that fall, running the old John Deere 45 combine, the two of them covered in dust, the work slow and steady. There was no talk of empires or leverage. They just talked about the weather, their families, and the quiet satisfaction of bringing in a crop, however humble. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed, but it was a different world, scarred and cautious. Earl's son, David, finished college with a degree in agronomy and came home to the farm. He had seen the devastation of the crisis firsthand and had come to understand the profound wisdom in his father's stubborn, old-fashioned ways. One crisp autumn afternoon in the late 1980s, Earl, now well into his 70s, stood at the edge of a cornfield, the stalks dry and rustling in the wind. His body ached, but his heart was full. In the distance, he could hear the steady, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of the John Deere 720, the tractor he'd rebuilt with his own hands. David was at the wheel, pulling a wagon filled with golden corn. David stopped the tractor beside him and climbed down, a smile on his face. "She's running good, Dad. That bearing you machined is holding up perfectly." "She'll outlast both of us if you take care of her," Earl said, placing a hand on the tractor's warm, green hood. He looked at his son, seeing the same love for the land in his eyes that his own father had passed to him. "You know," David said, looking out over the fields, the red barns, the white house nestled in the ancient oaks. "I was thinking about what you told Chet Thompson all those years ago, about this place being worth $5 million. Earl smiled, a slow, deep smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "It is, son. It is." He wasn't talking about the land, the buildings, or the machinery. He was talking about the 100 years of sweat and struggle soaked into the soil. He was talking about the freedom from fear, the knowledge in his hands, the legacy he was now passing to his son. He was talking about the quiet, unshakable wealth of a life lived on one's own terms, beholden to no one but the land and the sky. The old tractor idled peacefully beside them, its steady rhythm the heartbeat of a farm that had endured. It was the sound of a promise kept,